So here's a restoration project some of you guys might find interesting. This is a DiamondBack Response XE that a consignor has brought in, and we're going to see what we can do about getting this thing back in shape so that we can sell it for them. Now, normally when I remove a chain, I would probably use a chain breaker tool like this, but with a chain that's this far gone, I don't want to waste my tool on it, because the odds are that these rivets are so rusted in there, I'll probably end up breaking the pin off of the chain breaker. So what I'm going to do is just do it the old-fashioned way and just remove it manually. So the derailleurs seem to move pretty freely, but since this bike's been sitting for a while, I'm going to go ahead and just soak down the derailleurs with some penetrating oil just to make sure they're totally freed up. The front derailleur is kind of stiff, so I'm going to work some oil down into this. And in really bad cases, I'll go ahead and leave it for a couple of days to let it totally soak into there. This one is a little on the questionable side. I'm not sure if this is going to be savable or not, but we'll just go ahead and soak it down for the time being and see what happens after it's had a chance to let the oil work itself into there, because sometimes these can be recovered depending on the condition of it. All right, so I've let it sit for a little while, and I opened up the stops a little bit so that it could actually move through its full motion, and it appears to be slowly recovering. So I think, you know, if we just keep moving this around and lubricating it, eventually it'll get to the point where it's working adequately. So I think this is a savable part. I do think the shifter is working, so that's good. The cables are corroded, but not really bad, but I'm just going to go ahead, since we're doing an overhaul on this bike, I'm going to go ahead and replace the cables, so we'll go ahead and take all of those off. Now, once I got a look at the cables, the parts of them that were inside of the housing are relatively clean. There's almost no corrosion on them at all. So these probably could have been reused, but since this is a rebuild, I'm just going to go ahead and replace them anyway. But the fact that these are so clean on the inside tells me that the inside of the housings are probably equally good. So I'm going to go ahead and hang on to my housings, and we'll reuse those when we put the bike back together, because I don't see any chafing or cracking or dry rot on them, so I think these will be fine to reuse. The bottom bracket is nice and tight. There's no play in it at all, so I think the bottom bracket is going to be fine. Looking at the sprockets, or the chain rings, whatever you want to call them, they seem to be unbent, undamaged, and the teeth look pretty sharp on them, so these are not terribly worn down, so I think this is okay to reuse. The crankset, I think I'm just going to leave in place, but obviously these pedals are broken, so we're going to go ahead and remove these and replace them as well. The brake calipers are Tektro Novella CS mechanical brakes, which are a good medium-priced disc brake caliper. These are mechanical, so there's not a hydraulic actuator for these. These just use springs and cables in order to operate them. One thing I like about it is it doesn't need a spring to keep the brake pads separated. These actually have little magnets in them that hold the brake pads in, so you don't have to worry about fiddling with getting the little spring in there. As far as the brake pads go, they've got a lot of meat left on them, so I think I'm probably just going to clean these up and reuse them. So we're going to go ahead and reuse these parts on this build. I was able to let some goof off sit on this for a while, so the duct tape residue seems to be coming off nicely, which is more of an aesthetic thing than anything. But you know, when you're reconditioning a bike, nobody wants to have it with a bunch of old tape adhesive still on it. So we're going to go ahead and remove the rest of that, and it doesn't look half bad. Actually, the paint job looks fairly decent, and since this is an aluminum alloy frame, it's not going to be subject to a lot of oxidation. Although I have seen aluminum frames get their share of it. I've seen one of them that got left out in the sun for over a year, and one side of it was a different color than the other because the one side oxidized faster than the other. But in general, aluminum frames are pretty bulletproof, but you do have to also accept the fact that they are softer than steel, so you know, if you smack into something, you're probably going to dent it up pretty easily, so keep that in mind. Looking up here at the handlebars, these are just some cheap steel handlebars, and they've started to rust pretty badly, so you know, in a pinch I could probably just strip these down and repaint them. The stem is also pretty badly oxidized. So you can see this is aluminum. This is what happens when aluminum oxidizes real bad. It just starts, it almost like bubbles up under the paint and starts pushing the paint off of it. So it's not a structural defect. It just looks unsightly. So this can be repainted. I'm sort of on the fence as to exactly how far I want to go with the reconditioning on this bike, because I'm not entirely sure. Some of these DiamondBack Responses retailed for almost $1,000, and then some of them were only about $400. So I'm not entirely sure which end of the spectrum this bike was on, so I don't want to put a ton of money into it if it's only going to sell for a couple of $100s. Typically, when we sell bikes, we try to get 50% of the manufacturer's MSRP when we sell the bike, depending on the condition of it and, you know, other factors. There are some bikes that hold their value better or are more collectible, so I'm going to have to do a little more research on, you know, the actual value of this. Although judging by things like these shifters, these are the Shimano V-Brake dual action shifters where they have both the gear shifter and the brake on it. These are sort of their lower end system for brake levers and shifters. So judging by this and by, you know, the cable actuated disc brakes, I don't think this is a super high end model. I would tend to think the higher end ones would have the hydraulic brakes, although that's something that's easy enough to retrofit it for that. Some of these bikes, you know, they pass through a few different people's hands, so it may have been subject to somebody just throwing spare parts on it just to keep the bike running. But like I said in the beginning, we'll just have to figure out exactly what the bike is worth, and that'll determine whether or not we're going to put better parts back on it. Although these shifters move freely, they don't bind up at all. So I tend to think we're probably just going to clean these up and reuse them. The handlebars, on the other hand, I've got some nice alloy ones that we could throw on there that might look a little bit nicer. And these grips are pretty worn, so we're going to go ahead and remove that and replace those parts as well. This seat is obviously not the original seat that came with the DiamondBack, since this is a Roadmaster seat. And the seat post is a little odd in that the main seat post is aluminum alloy, but it looks like somebody's pounded a steel seat post down into it to accommodate this particular saddle. One problem that we get quite often is if people put the wrong size seat post into the frame, if it's too big and they pound it into there, you're never going to get it out. But luckily, in the case of this particular seat post, this was not the case, so this does come out fairly easily. So we will probably just replace the saddle with something that's a little bit nicer. Although this is a Roadmaster saddle, there is nothing specifically wrong with it, so we'll probably just reuse it on a Roadmaster rather than on a DiamondBack. And it's just nice to have a fairly comfortable seat. But remember, anytime you're putting a seat post into a frame, make sure that it's the proper size, and if it's too big, don't frickin' force it, because you're never going to get it out. We've got you know, stuff we've hammered on them, we've heated them up with torches, and they just would not budge in a lot of cases. We've even had like slide hammers, like 50-pound slide hammers, still would not budge them out of there. So don't screw with that. If it's not the right size, get the right size. And ironically, with bicycles, the one part on this bike that is not a standard size is the seat post. Every bicycle, it seems like, has a slightly different seat post, even by a couple of tenths of a millimeter. It can make the difference between being able to adjust it and having it stuck hopelessly in the frame and never being able to get it out. So get in there with a pair of calipers, make sure that it's the right size, and only put the right parts in there. Last thing we're going to disassemble is the headset, which includes the fork, the stem, and the bearing system in there. I just want to get a good idea what's going on with the bearings and see if they need to be lubricated. This is a threadless fork system, so there is no bolt on the top that holds this together. What it does instead is there is a central bolt in the top of the stem that goes down into the fork, and that's what sort of pulls everything together. So when you remove this, the fork's going to want to drop right out the bottom of the frame. So you want to keep a handle on the forks, because it's going to want to just take off and fall out off of the frame. There are two bolts on the sides here that sort of clamp the stem down onto the fork, which we can loosen up here. And then we're just going to go ahead and disassemble this. Just take the bolt out. This is the stem. There's several spacers. This is the top bearing race and the dust cover. And then we can finally get down to the bearings here. And you can see that these are just old-fashioned exposed bearings. These are not some fancy sealed bearing units, so we'll just re-grease these and put them back together. They seem to have all of their bearings, and they don't seem to be in any kind of bad shape, so we're just going to reuse all of this. So that's about as far as I'm going to go with disassembling this particular project. Everything else seems to be in reasonably good shape, so I don't think it's necessary to take apart any of these other parts on the bike. So we're just going to go ahead and leave that the rest of the way and just probably lube it up a little bit more. But I think this is a good place that we can start putting the bike back together again. So if you want to keep up with this project, just stay tuned, and we'll let you know what happens.